Josh Chatraw was appointed the Billy Graham Chair for Evangelism and Cultural Engagement this year. He moved into Pelham this summer. His research, writing, and speaking focuses on public theology, apologetics, evangelism, and culture. He's co-written written or edited 8 books, including The Augustine Way, Surprised by Doubt, those are Josh's 2 most recent books, Apologetics at the Cross, Cultural Engagement, The History of Apologetics, Telling a Better Story, that was a big award-winning book a few years ago, some of you may have seen that one, Truth Matters, and Truth in a Culture of Doubt. His writing has received numerous awards, including Christianity Today's Evangelism and Apologetics Book of the Year, Outreach Magazine Resource of the Year in Apologetics, and the Gospel Coalition's Book of the Year in Apologetics and Evangelism. He's also contributed numerous essays and articles in both academic and popular publications. He serves as an inaugural fellow at the Timothy Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He's also a fellow at the Center for Pastor Theologians. Josh Chatraw is a good friend of mine, has been for a long time. He is a faithful disciple maker. He's a godly man, and he's a wonderful speaker as well.
I want to say that I am delighted to be at Beeson. Several alumni, right when they got the announcement, wrote me letters. I was like, you are coming to a special place. And I have certainly felt that way from even when I showed up over the summer and not very many people were around, but Gerald Bray was around. And so I got the official Gerald Bray tour around Birmingham. Took me to places no one else would take me, he says. You can ask him about that. And I will say that I have these 2 new books out, and some places want me to speak. I go to different places, go to some seminaries, do this, and that's fun. And I go to those places, and I think, this is nice, but it's not Beeson. It is not Beeson. And maybe I'm in the honeymoon stage, I'm not sure, but it's been a great few months. When I was asked to speak, it was mentioned that I might give an update on developments in my discipline. So here's my update on apologetics. Persuasion is still hard. Persuasion is still very hard. If you don't believe me, you either don't have kids or your kids are too young. But just wait until they are about 14 and try to convince your daughter really about anything. Sure, I can make her do things. But persuading her, goodness, convincing your kids, your teenage kids, that what you're saying as their father is actually in their best interest. It tests every fiber of my ability as a professional apologist. And I'm their dad. In the best of circumstances, in trusted relationships, persuasion can be difficult. We know that. We've had those conversations. But in an increasingly post-Christian society, when Christianity is viewed, much more than it used to anyway, as repressive, persuasion's really hard. When we're experiencing the kind of polarization that we're experiencing these days, and as Andy Crouch puts it, we have shrinking circles of trust. Persuasion, gospel persuasion, can feel overwhelmingly hard. In the midst of these challenges, I just want to say it is all too easy for us as professors, even evangelism professors, to become comfortable simply talking about theology in the safe confines of our classrooms. Or, as a minister, it could be tempting to simply talk theology and appeal to the base. But I want us all to be reminded that many Christians, and no doubt many of us in this room at times feel this too, that you don't have the luxury of this kind of insulation. For the father whose daughter is deconstructing, for family members who have family members who are part of that de-churching that Doug mentioned last night. For the mom who's grappling with what feels like God's absence, and you as a minister needs to speak to her and give her a word of comfort, as John and I talked about last night. For the counselors who have angst-ridden believers confess their doubts to them weekly. For the pastor who, in the midst of this polarization, will not give up on trying to create a culture of evangelism. For the college student burdened over their lost friends. For the preacher straining each week to battle the cultural narratives that are catechizing his or her flock. For saints such as these, apologetics is not a theoretical discipline. It's a very practical discipline. It's a day-to-day discipline. And yet, I would suggest that apologetics has kind of fallen out of favor in certain theological circles. I won't dare to ask those in the room who what's the last time you've read an apologetics book? Maybe it's more recent than I might imagine. So here's my second part of my update on apologetics. There's some truth in the fact that some forms of apologetics are stuck in an overly rationalistic and theoretical mode, which has not paid enough attention to our context and how it's shifted. It's true that some forms of apologetics have lacked a kind of pastoral sensitivity. And maybe those are the reasons you said, give me the theology books, give me the counseling books. And in some sense, I can empathize with that. I was there. I used to be in the same place. So if you are kind of coming into this talk and thinking of apologetics as a kind of arid, triumphalistic logic chopping, I want to say that there's some truth in that. But it seems to me there is an awakening in the force. That's for my son Hudson. He'll be really excited. I fit that in. With the new challenges of a post-Christian world, the Lord is raising up, at least as I see it, a new kind of evangelist. What I call pastor theologian apologists. And these are men and women who are asking the question, how might we reach the modern pagan with the gospel? Those are the apologists I want to spend my time with. Those are the apologists we want to raise up here. Pastor, theologian, evangelist, apologists. Now, I used that phrase just a second ago, modern pagan, not in any pejorative sense, but descriptively. It was T.S. Eliot who said that the West will have to choose between one of two options. Eliot predicted the choice will be between either Christianity or paganism. By paganism, he meant a religious outlook that sacralizes the material world. More recently, in a sweeping look at our religious landscape with her book Strange Rites, Tara Isabella Burton provides the receipts to support Eliot's thesis. The religious unaffiliated, the nuns, as they have been labeled, are the fastest growing demographic in America, comprising a quarter of the population and almost 40% of those born after 1990. And yet, despite what the label might suggest, Burton reveals that this group is anything but non-religious. Westerners, as it turns out, aren't actually shunning religion. They are instead remixing religion, creating their own bespoke religions. This is a quote from her. Their own bespoke religions, mixing and matching spiritual and aesthetic and experiential and philosophical traditions. In other words, these aren't the new atheists. And so if our apologetic is built on engaging new atheists, and we look around Birmingham, and yes, they're in the chat rooms, they're on the Reddit threads, but the kind of aggressive atheism isn't normally what people will meet. And so with the decline of Christendom, what seems to have happened is the media and consumeristic forces have been happy to swoop into the spaces left by the dominance of Christianity and offer grand stories and almost religious-like promises of salvation, forming visions of the good and the beautiful toward their shows and products and services. as post-Christian sensibilities are formed by a consumeristic individualism that sees personal choice as an ultimate end. The result is Christianity, with its call to die to self, and given Christianity's checkered past, it's been deemed the villain of the drama that the West is only beginning to be liberated from, or so the story goes. We've moved, as Philip Brief put it, in the 60s, for goodness sakes. He predicted this in the 60s with his book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, that we're moving from a society that saw humans as needing to be saved to now viewing ourselves as creatures needing to be pleased. The question then becomes, how do we persuade in a you do you therapeutic culture which imagines that where people can imagine they can consume their way to their preferred vision of the good life? Now track with me for a second. If we invite modern day pagans to simply look more closely at traditional rationalistic arguments for Christianity, and I think, by the way, we need arguments, what I would call traditional arguments for Christianity, evidences for the resurrection, evidences that we can retrieve from the tradition. So I'm not altogether against that. But if we're simply doing that, our new pagans, our modern pagans, they won't have much incentive to take us up on the offer, to come reason along with us. And if they do, if they actually do spend some time reasoning along with us, this kind of rationality will unlikely make much sense to them. They'll simply go on living their life, pursuing what they feel to be fulfilling and imagine to be good, their moral and aesthetic visions being formed not by syllogisms, but rather along the logic of the dominant cultural myths in which they live and breathe and have their being each day. I hope you can begin to understand the nature of the kind of apologetic challenge. In fact, I'm guessing you already sense this in your own context in different ways. Part of the real challenge, part of the double challenge of this is these myths have actually, they're not just out there, whatever out there in culture is. Of course, they're being absorbed by our people. They're being absorbed by us. And so they're catechizing our people. And so Peter Kreeft wrote about this years ago when he said, most Christian apologetics today is still written from a medieval mindset in one sense, as if we still lived in a Christian culture, a Christian civilization, a society that reinforced the gospel. No, the honeymoon is over. The Middle Ages are over. Though, then he adds, the news has not sunk in fully in many quarters. So what might we do? Do we give up on persuasion? Do we simply reason with the approaches that we've inherited, imagining that these approaches themselves maybe, wrongly imagining that these approaches themselves were not developed within a certain contingent context? Do we try to develop some kind of completely new method? These are questions that me and kind of a cohort of friends have been asking for some time. And what we basically said is, we need to go backwards. We need to go backwards to go forward. This is kind of the Beeson way anyway, I think, right? Back further, even in the Middle Ages, to those who were persuading the old pagans in a pluralistic world, yes, the early church. And who better than Augustine, the most important theologian in the Western tradition? In the City of God and in Confessions, Augustine diagnoses distorted aspirations within his own culture, the narratives of his culture, and then he sought to show how they could only fully be restored within the story of Christ. Now, there is a version of this talk where I spend the next 30 minutes on City of God. This is not Beckwith's class, though, okay? Some of you have had that class. All right, so that is a version that I do. I just did that talk somewhere. And let me just give you macro structure of City of God. First 10 books of City of God, he steps inside the dominant narratives of his culture. He offers a critique from the inside. And then he steps into 11 through 22, and he starts narrating the gospel story. I want to suggest to you that gives us a kind of pattern All right? Part of the problem with City of God, if you step in and you're looking for just apologetic nuggets, you're overwhelmed and you don't find many. But if you look at patterns and strategies with Augustine, all of a sudden things came alive for us. So, following Augustine's lead, what I want to do is to suggest that there's actually a way for us today not to annihilate the modern therapeutic scripts of our day. So follow along. Not to annihilate them, but to capture them with the gospel. To speak with, against, but ultimately for modern pagans. It's not us versus them. All right? It's come in and be captured by this story. The gospel is, after all, as John mentioned yesterday, good news, a word of comfort, even to modern pagans. We have what they're looking for. They're just looking in all the wrong places. So for the rest of my time, I'm not going to do that version of the talk where I talk methodology. I want to try something else. And I want us to look at a text. So turn with me to Psalm 32. And as you're turning there, let me say, well, at least two things, just as you're getting there in your Bibles or on your phone. One of the features of the City of God and Confessions is that Augustine has multiple audiences in view. And it seems to me, in so much of our preaching and teaching, that is true for us today still, right? And especially with many of the sermons are recorded. You don't know who's listening to this. This is being recorded right now. Who's going to go online and listen to it? So I think that's instructive. And one of the things that in both books, I can make an argument, I don't have time today, but Confessions does have a kind of undercurrent of apologetics. That can be afterwards if you want to talk to me about that. But what Augustine is doing is he's evangelizing while he's catechizing, and he's catechizing while he evangelizes. And I want to suggest for us that in our counseling of Christians, in our discipleship, in our teaching, in our preaching, you not only think about catechesis, but you think about catechesis as a way to actually equip your people to do evangelism and, dare we say, apologetics. Okay, and so I want to try to model that while I'm speaking to you. I'm going to try to model this as catechesis and a form of evangelism. So do you want to be happy? Do you want to be happy? In Book 19 of the City of God, the ancient bishop, in line with the philosophers of his era, argue that we all want to be happy. So our problem is not today that people want to be happy. The problem is that we have somehow lost our way. We want happiness, we want love, and we want to be loved, and we seek after that joy that comes with these relationships, but we have the propensity to really, really, really mess these things up. Now, don't get me wrong, when we speak about humans as messing things up, I want to quickly say that not only are we wonderful creatures, not only are we wretched creatures, we're wonderful creatures. We're marvelous creatures made by a good God to care for his creation, to make beautiful things. But we are also fragile creatures, made to live independence of our Creator. And that's what we find in Genesis 1 and 2. And yet something has gone wrong. We know this story. Something is the matter with us. We think we know what we want. We think we know how to find happiness. But as the proverb says, there is a way that seems right to a man that leads to death. And that's Genesis 3. We need to figure out a way. I want to suggest we figure out ways to map this reality on everyday experience. If you want to see just one way to do this, you could just come to my 10-year-old soccer game this weekend. You'll see kids with the wonderful ability to learn and move and be creative and show compassion, helping their teammates. And if you're like my son, you help the other people's, you help his opponents. And you'll see parents who are delightfully caring for their children. That's this little picture in some fallen sense of Genesis 1 and 2 of God's good creation. He's created it structurally good. But stay a little bit longer. Look a little closer. And you'll see parents overinvest. And oh my, do we overinvest. Shouts of encouragement quickly turns into anger at teenage referees who soon are crying. Belittling comments about players and coaches are muttered sometimes a little too loud. These are 10-year-olds. The players themselves, as cute as they are, begin bullying their teammates or feeling ashamed of their own ability. They slide. You'll see a few slide to the edge of the bench, hoping the coach doesn't put them in. That shame, that starts early. That's Genesis 3. And you can map this paradox of the human experience onto everything from family life to the corporate boardroom. In fact, you can do this, and what you're doing is you're showing people that the Christian story explains their world. It's an apologetic. And in doing that, you're showing them, and this is Pascal's first move, by the way, he suggests for us to take apologetically. Show them that they should at the very least respect Christianity because it explains human nature. It explains so much about the world. And then I would say take Pascal's second move in some sense here, which is to ask people the question in some way, in some form, which makes sense in your context, which is in the midst of this broken world and in our propensity to mess things up, where is true joy to be found? Now, if you're thinking to yourself, you said turn to Psalm 32, and this seems, at least in part, a lament, and this is a strange way to start a biblical lament. Keep in mind, this is no ordinary lament. In fact, there's lament in it, but this is a psalm about wisdom. But here's the connection. In a post-Genesis 3 world, in a broken world where we humans mess things up, the wisdom needed to find true joy, strangely enough, hangs on lament. And so here's what I'm doing. I'm taking this desire to be happy, and I'm saying you're going about it the wrong way. I'm not completely annihilating that. I'm sure you can't get it there. So look at verse 1. Blessed is the one. By starting with blessed is the one, David is not saying, of course, and I hope you don't hear this from what I'm suggesting, that somehow this is health, wealth, gospel. It's not health, wealth, gospel. He's not saying that somehow everything's going to be great if you do this. That everything will fall into place in your life just as you want it. But I think what David is actually saying here is this is how to live with the grain of the universe. Most translations today use the word blessed rather than happy. Some use the word joy here. And the reason they don't, of course, use happy is happy rings kind of shallow in our ears. In a culture where we often use the word happy to describe how we feel when you get a new pair of shoes, or when we finally finish remodeling the bathroom, or when we just shot a great round of golf, we say we're happy. But we know these are short-lived forms of happiness. But so much of our modern world is built to try to hide our eyes from how short-term these are. We know that our shoes will wear out. We know the kitchen will one day become outdated. Our golf games, along with our bodies, will eventually deteriorate. And so much of our world is meant to divert our eyes. Pascal would call these diversions. In his world, of course, that was gambling and cards. If only Pascal could teleport through time and see us today. Now we hide behind 85-inch televisions and our busy schedules, and yet the dark shadow of death looms. I think part of the apologetic task is just to keep reminding people, as the teacher says in Ecclesiastes 7, that the wise man goes to a funeral, not a party. It's to sober, right? It's to sober. It's to remind them, where is that going? What then? Psalm 32 is pointing us to a deeper wisdom and a deeper joy than the cheap consumer wisdom and pleasures of our age. David is gesturing to a timeless desire that whether someone's a Christian or non-Christian, I would want to suggest they feel it in their bones, even if they can't verbally express it. David shows us the way. Look at the rest of verse 1. Blessed, or we might say flourishing, is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Flourishing is the man against whom the Lord accounts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. I think I need to be honest, and maybe just in your own soul you can be honest, because of how we have been catechized ourselves. I don't typically believe this verse. What do you imagine when you imagine flourishing? When you hear that word flourishing, where does that take you now? Now, for some of you, that might take you to sipping on a glass of wine, overlooking a vineyard, especially if you're Anglican. Or for me, a Baptist, it's sipping on some non-alcoholic coffee drink on a sabbatical surrounded by books. Or maybe flourishing evokes images of you just finally doing some self-care. Escaping to a place, maybe just in your own daydreams, where people stop asking you for stuff. Your kids, your spouse, your staff, they just leave you alone. David Foster Wallace, who, if you know anything about David Foster Wallace, he's not a Christian author, but he pointed out years ago that self-centeredness is something that goes far beyond any kind of cultural mood. It's something deeper than just their therapeutic age. Wallace observed this. He said, everything in my own immediate experience supports my deepest belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, the most vivid and important person in existence. We rarely think about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive. But it's pretty much the same for all of us. It's our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. This hardwired selfishness, Augustine would have loved this, by the way. Read the early part of Confessions. We Christians, he didn't love the selfishness. He would have loved Wallace's description. But we Christians call this sinful nature. And it's at the heart of what's the matter with humans since Genesis 3. But here's my point. We've got to figure out ways to talk about it, right? And oftentimes it's bringing along a certain cultural authority like David Foster Wallace to give terms that a secular person can respect and understand. But even more than that, the challenge in our modern consumeristic therapeutic world is that visions of the good life often reinforce and affirm this kind of self-centeredness. That this self-centeredness is actually the key to happiness. My goals, my comfort, me in control, and everyone and everything revolving around me. But one of the problems with self-absorption is it doesn't work. Now, there's more problems with that. It's an offense against the God who is the living God. But it also just doesn't work. It eventually leads to misery. It hollows us. It makes us less capable of truly loving others, of receiving love as a gift. At times, I want to acknowledge that some forms of self-absorption can actually feel good, but think about what it's doing. It's numbing us from the pain of our own disordered loves. It leaves us numb so we can't experience the deeper joys that come through sacrifice, of giving of ourselves. The psalm is calling us to recalibrate, to see our self-absorption for what it is, namely sin against God and against our neighbor. God is calling us to the painful treatment of decentering ourselves. It begins by lamenting over our sin, and I want to suggest to my non-Christian friends and remind my Christian friends, it is a radical treatment plan. But it's the only path to truly being healed. So much of our current cultural and personal malaise is that the main scripts we absorb, the main ways we are being catechized in this therapeutic age teach us not to grieve over sin. It teaches us quickly move on, to not look at sin, not call it sin. We've lost And with that, we've lost the resources to find forgiveness and also to be a people who forgive others. You can, again, map this out. You can trace this out in so many different ways. Help them see what this causes. We feel the pain and injustices of our world, and we look for something or someone else to blame, for someone or someone else to pay. Our society no longer sacrifices animals to make atonement, but that doesn't stop us from trying to find scapegoats. We live in a council culture, a culture of microaggressions and culture's war. So it's all too easy to fall in the trap of imagining our own heart issues are someone else's fault. So we blame. We blame parents, we blame our kids, we blame our coworkers, we blame our congregations, and we're hollowed out from the inside. Instead, the psalm says, flourishing is the one who doesn't cover over their sin, but has their sin covered up by God. Flourishing is the one who is free from condemnation, free from self-condemnation of not measuring up to those around us, and free from condemnation over your biggest critics. When you come to an event like this, it's always great to see other ministers, but can be a part of us that's just always measuring. It's always measuring. And it's the gospel that frees us, right? We don't have to condemn ourselves. We're freed up to actually rejoice with our brothers and sisters. Some of you are coming here and you've gotten another email maybe while you've been here. The critics keep coming in. The critiques keep coming in. But flourishing is the one whose sins are covered by God, and so you don't have to try to cover your sins by your own performance. You're not living out a self-salvation project. But too often our modern myths actually keep us trying to hide from our guilt. In order to cope with the shame, we stay busy. We continue the exhausting work of keeping up appearances. We go along with everyone else in curating false images of ourselves, signaling our own righteousness. But part of our problem is actually the entire performance. In our performative world, we've learned how to put on a good show, but we've forgotten how to lament. But even the best actors, even the non-Christians who are acting, and they're really good at this show, they have their moments when the curtain drops. And they experience verse 3. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. The blasphemous lie of the serpent in Genesis 3 was that somehow we'd be better off if we did it our way. But that, again, never works in the long run. And one day, you'll come to the end of yourself. And when you do, and this is the call, this is the evangelistic call, you'll have two options. You can keep silent. Of course, there's lots of ways to keep silent. You blame others. You become petty. In your stubbornness, you can grow more callous and brittle. You can divert your attention from the pain through shopping and streaming services and a host of other ways, but you'll only be treating the symptoms. If you keep silent, the cancer eating away at your heart will metastasize, and you'll end up just like David in verse 4, with a withered and shriveled soul. But there is another way. There's another way. Verse 5. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. The good life is characterized not by self-expression, but by confession. And it is here that we must never refuse to stop asking the question. Asking the question, even to people who say, I don't feel guilty. The question, though, is still that I want to ask them, and I want to encourage you to continue to ask, is what will you do with your shame? What will you do with your guilt? They might say that they don't feel guilty, but their bones and groans will not let them off the hook. If you do nothing, your guilt will one day destroy you. In the Old Testament, Of course, we're reminded over and over again, and David would have been well aware of God's self-revelation. He is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sins, but he will by no means clear the guilty. David knows this God. So in the psalm, he knows he can find God and he can find mercy. But he doesn't see with the same clarity the grounding of this forgiveness. This is why the Old Testament is always pushing forward to a better David. Because we know Jesus came not only to show us this way, but actually to be the way to find this forgiveness, to be the path to forgiveness. This is the objective answer to guilt. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. All of us know this objective reality. Many of you went to Beeson, for goodness sake. You know not only the reality, the objective reality of the atonement, you know all the different theories of the atonement. You know all the verses about the atonement, and many of you know them in multiple languages. And that is good. But it also could be camouflage. See, we academic types, and let's just be honest, if you made it all the way through Beeson, that means I'm talking to you. We academic types hide our wounds behind our intellect. One of the side effects can be a failure to humbly open ourselves up to God, to open ourselves up to the grace of God. In my recent book, Surprised by That, I opened the preface just admitting as much in my own life. I say much of my life, my work, my sense of worth, my identity has operated from the slippery slope of achievement. I now see that burden seeped into my faith. So I know, and you know, all about the objective reality of the atonement, but my bet is some of you are struggling with the subjective reality this afternoon. You're still struggling with shame. You're still struggling with guilt. You despair when people think poorly of you. You have trouble handling critique. You feel a sense of shame about your weaknesses as a leader, the size of your church. Your life is too often characterized by certain metallic hardness and bitterness in your conversations and dealings with others. And if that is you, and I imagine in some sense, in some way it's all of us, there's this disconnect between the objective reality of the forgiveness that you have in Christ and the subjective reality of shame and the guilt that you still feel. So then what do we do? Verses 6 and 7. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at the time when you may be found. David is reminding us there is still time to call on the Lord, even right now. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Not only does God himself give us cover and care to those who call on him, but did you notice the last verse? This confession, this lament moves David into corporate worship. The only cure for false worship is true worship. And let's make no mistake about it. We are worshiping beings. So in the sense, if we're talking about a secular age, what we don't mean is people aren't worshiping something. And so one of the ways we confront false worship is by becoming the right type of apologist, becoming the right type of evangelist, which means people who themselves confess. We get up each morning and we confess and we worship. Worship starts with confession. And so then verse 8, God shows up and he speaks. He says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with an eye upon you. Knowing God begins not with an abstract doctrine, but with humble confession. And this is no depersonalized manual for life. God gives us his counsel with his eye upon us. As a loving father instructs while he intently watches his child through his word and his presence, God is with us. God is instructing us. So verse 9, be not like a horse or a mule without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you. Of course, you can stubbornly run and hide from God, but this is a path to dehumanization. Like animals, we can live by instinct, or we can live in a relationship with the living God. So verses 10 and 11. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. So 2 ways to live. The way of the wicked, and one of the problems with the way of the wicked is that it will eventually lead to sorrows. But before you today, before each of us today, before your congregation, before the non-Christians who you will speak to this week, the way of wisdom is not far. For the way has come to us in a person. The way has shown us the steadfast love of the Father. There's a scene in one of the latest episodes of the first season of Ted Lasso. Now, I need to tell a quick story about Ted Lasso. It's not a kid-friendly show, okay? So when I was at Holy Trinity Anglican, I would use Ted Lasso as an example, and I would say it's not a kid-friendly show. And certainly there would be, sweet old ladies wondering, why have you mentioned that show, Ted Lasso? We watched it. So I just want to give that disclaimer, okay? I know most of you are watching it anyway. So, okay, so at the end of the first season, you have the coach, Ted, and you have the team owner, Rebecca. And it's a story about a British soccer team. And Rebecca's the owner, and she's furious at her ex-husband. And so the way to get at her is to ruin the soccer team. And so she hires this kind of Dabo Sweeney kind of character, if you know anything about Clemson football. I didn't mean it as a compliment. But and hires Ted Lasso so that it will ruin the team. And as she's going along, she realizes that by ruining the team, she'll also ruin Ted Lasso's life. And she's starting to feel this heavy weight of guilt, but she suppresses it. But she finally, towards the end of season 1, she comes to Ted and confesses it all, and she expects Ted's going to hate her. And Ted looks at her, acknowledging the reality of what she did, and then with a smile, he says 3 words: I forgive you. Rebecca is taken aback. She says, you what? Why? And then her shock turns into this joy. That's what we all want, isn't it? Not from Ted Lasso, right? He's just a silly character on a show. But we want someone who knows us, someone who knows not just a little bit, but all of us, all of our messiness and all of our sinfulness, who will say, yes, I know you, and I forgive you. But what if, and by the way, that what if, I want to encourage you to use that in conversations with non-Christians. By just saying what if, you can pack as much theology in as you want, right? You don't have to come like, oh, let me do this philosophy on their common ground. You can just say, what if the resurrection's true? You're just, because you're asking them to use their imagination, right? And you're starting at the level, what if? What if there is a God? And what if the living God were to say to you, yes, I know, I see you. And even when the curtain drops, even when you've stopped acting, I know your mess, I know your sin, and I forgive you. That is what God has said on the cross. And the God of the cross is inviting you to his way. It begins with confession, not because he's waiting to shame you or counsel you, but because he wants you to see him smile over you. So, back to apologetics. Let me close on this. There's a popular meme going around, and it says something like, facts don't care about your feelings. That was the kind of apologetics that I was brought into. Facts don't care about your feelings. It's a put down. And of course, it's true. Facts, math equations, the chair you're sitting in, none of these things care about your feelings. And maybe that's why in a materialistic world where God feels less real, we feel so lonely. But part of the good news is that while facts don't care about your feelings, the Psalms teach us that your heavenly Father does. He cares about your feelings so much, he wants you to pour your feelings out to him. So there's an invitation in a therapeutic age. Don't be silent. Don't let your bones waste away. Don't let your soul wither away. But do you know what else? While God does care about your feelings, the good news is he doesn't simply affirm all your feelings. He loves us too much for that. Instead, he calls us. He calls us to a rehabilitation program for our soul. The program starts with lament, but it ends with rejoicing. And I think that is what St. Augustine meant when he says, in Christ, we are happy in hope.